Welcome back, everyone, to the second session of All in the Family, Problematic Relationships in the Law Codes of Deuteronomy with Rabbi David Silber. This is a continuation of his Sunday Tanakh series, picking up from when we last left off before Shavuos. One of the foci of the legal section of Deuteronomy relates to complicated issues related to marriage and family relationships. These 4 studies will undertake a study of texts relating to the captive consort, the rebellious child, the defaming husband, and the recalcitrant levir. It's always a pleasure learning with Rabbi Silber today. We want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear your comments. Please do not hesitate to ask questions when Rabbi Silber pauses, or ask in chat whenever, and I will relay them to him. And with that, Rabbi Silber, I'm handing over the mic to you.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Okay, so as Kayla said, focus will be some of the rules, laws relating to relationships. And as I mentioned last week, these set of laws form a significant portion of the section of laws in the book of Devarim. It's interesting because one might have expected them to appear earlier in the Torah. It's not related necessarily to coming into the land. So we discussed it a bit last week in terms of when one comes into the land, it's really about community. It's a different kind of community when you're in the land, you have your own land, etc., your own institution. So connected to that in terms of relationship of community, but at the same time, by the same token, there is a parallel, one might say, discussion of relationships within families. And the law deals with problematic relationships. The law in general is dealing with situations that are problematic. When things are going just fine, there's no need to suggest specific ways of behavior. Everything is working. It's when things don't work or problems emerge that the law comes into play. Before we start, the new law that we'll deal with today, the defaming husband, I did want to reflect a bit on what we talked about last time. We talked about last time the text in Dvarim in chapter 21 that talks about what's called the Yafat Torah. That is to say, there's a war, and you defeat your enemies, and you take captives. And amongst the captives, the Torah says, is a beautiful woman. You see a beautiful woman, you desire her, that is, a soldier does. And then there is a procedure that is to take place in order to allow this woman to be part of the family, part of the community. Again, I'm not getting into all the details about what happened on the battlefield. Have they had relations already during the war? Or no, the Torah is saying you may desire her, but you have to wait. And they have to go through this entire procedure. And last week we discussed the question as to what is the point of this procedure. And there's a great dispute here. Rashi, on one hand, has one point of view, and others, the Ramban, have a different point of view. But I wanted to mention, I didn't mention this last time, Rashi has a comment in his commentary. That's a very well-known comment and a very interesting one, an important one. Rashi's position, Rashi says that this entire parsha is not optimal. Lo dibra Torah ela keneged yetzer hara. The Torah says that these rules are dealing with one's evil inclination. That is to say, there is something, says Rashi, very problematic about the entire thing, about taking this foreign hostage into the community, because you see her on the battlefield, you desire, etc. And Rashi says that the whole thing should never happen. The Torah doesn't want it to happen. And Rashi adds, and if it does happen, then Rashi says, that leads us to the next parsha. The next parsha, right after the Yafat Torah, which is chapter 21, verse number 10, as we saw last week, the parsha that follows immediately is Ki tiyenu leish shtei noshim, a man who has 2 wives. Achat ahuva v'achat snua. One is beloved, and one is hated, literally hated, or unbeloved, undesired. Here they translate unloved. The word snua means more than just unloved. And they both have children. He has children from both, the beloved one and the other one. But the oldest child, but the the unloved one gives birth to the firstborn. Then the Torah says, "V'haya b'yom hanchilo et banav." At the time when one is handing his possessions over to his descendants, those we would call rules of inheritance. Rules of inheritance. The Torah says, "Lo yuchal levaker et ben ha'ahuva al pnei ben hasnua habechor." You are not allowed to favor levaker from the word bechor. You can't treat the child of the beloved wife. You can favor the child of the beloved wife over the child of the unbeloved wife. You can't treat that one as a bechor. No, you can't do that. You recognize the rights of the older one, of the unbeloved one. What does that mean, recognize the rights? To get a double portion. The Torah says, in passing over here, that the firstborn gets a double portion. That is the way it's understood is, let's say if there are 5 children, it's divided into 6 portions. The oldest one gets 2 of the 6, and the others get 1 portion. So who gets the double portion? Says the Torah, you can't favor the son of the beloved one. You must favor the son of the unbeloved one. Why? Kihu reshito, no. This is the first of your vigor. In other words, this is your actual firstborn. Lo mishpata b'chora. That child is deserving of the portion of the firstborn. So Rashi connects the 2 parshiot, as Rashi often does. Rashi says, if you marry this woman, this captive woman, you're going to end up with an unbeloved woman, and then you're going to run into trouble. There's going to be disputes in the family because this person was brought into the family. That's Rashi's drasha, one might say, on the relationship between these 2 parshiot, but it all fits in with Rashi's basic idea. Rashi's idea is that the Torah is the rules of the Yafat Torah are a concession to human weakness and human error. Now, the point is that for Rashi, I want to emphasize this, for Rashi, this idea that the law can be seen as a concession to human frailty, for Rashi might limit it to certain cases. This particular case for Rashi is one which the Torah itself, as Rashi understands it, is saying don't do it. Because Rashi's understanding of Yifat Torah, and we discussed this last week, is that everything she has to do, which Rashi interprets as growing her nails, cutting her hair, taking off the garments which she thinks is beautiful garments. She went into war to entice the Israelite soldiers. She was wearing beautiful clothing that she has to take off. So everything she's doing for Rashi is to make her look unattractive to the soldier who has taken her from captivity. That's Rashi's point of view. Most of the other commentaries take precisely the opposite point of view, that taking off the garments of the captivity, she had shabby garments. She has to dress properly now. Cutting her fingernails, not that she grows the fingernails, that she cuts her fingernails. She goes to the manicurist or whatever. All this is to give her more of a sense of dignity. She's not simply a captured woman. So they go in the opposite direction. But I did want to mention this Rashi because it raises a very interesting question about law in general. That what Rashi is saying over here, if we take this, leaving Rashi's interpretation of this parsha out, but just this idea of Dibra Torah Keneged Yetzer Hara, that the Torah sometimes deals with human reality, that the law is not optimal. The law is a necessary response to a situation which is problematic. That I think is a very important idea in terms of law. And I just wanted to say that that's what Rashi says over here, and Rashi might limit it to these particular cases, might even limit it to this particular case. But the one who actually raises the question of law in general is not really Rashi. Rashi, in general, takes the opposite point of view. The law is what is required. Don't do less, don't do more, and you'll be perfectly fine. Okay, if you want to be a tzaddik and do more, Rashi's not opposed. But the law suffices. The one who disagrees with that, and we've encountered this several times during our studies over the years, is the Ramban. And the Ramban takes the position that you can be what he calls a naval b'shut Torah, that the law is a minimum standard, but the goal is kadoshim tiyu, says the Ramban. The goal is to be holy. The Ramban doesn't fully define what that means to be holy, but it goes beyond the law. And the Ramban says that actually you can keep the whole law and be a bad person. You can keep every law and still not be a good person, still be a bad person. In fact, one of the examples that the Ramban gives to somebody who keeps the law but is a bad person is actually the very next parsha that I just read, which is the parsha of the not the next parsha, the parsha afterwards, Ben Soreo Moreh, the third parsha. The parsha afterwards is about the rebellious child, which Rashi connects all three. You're going to get married to this Yifat Toar, you have a problem in the family, and then you have the Ben Soreh Umoreh. For Rashi, that's a result. The three parshiot are connected. The Ramban actually references the parsha of the rebellious child that we'll deal with either next week or the week after. But the story of the rebellious child is that this rebellious child, we are told, does not obey his parents. And when they bring the child to the elders of the town, which is found a little later, they say, our child doesn't obey our voice, doesn't listen, zolel v'sovei, a glutton and a drunkard, a glutton and a drunkard. And the Ramban cites this. The Ramban says, there's no place in the Torah where it says, do not become a drunkard. There is no place in the Torah where it says, do not be a glutton. There are verses in the Proverbs, but in the Torah itself, which is the source of law, it never says anything. Says the Ramban, you don't violate a law, but you're not holy. There is this idea of being holy, which transcends the law. So this idea of, for the Ramban, the relationship between doing the right thing, doing the good thing, and the law is an interesting relationship for the Ramban. And I mentioned that in this context, Rashi, I think, may disagree with the Ramban about that. But Rashi does put out there the idea that the Torah, on occasion, I don't know how many occasions, is saying, in effect, the law has to deal with reality. And I wanted just to come back to what I mentioned last week, a different Ramban. And the Ramban, which was the other main theme of these laws, you got to pick out two main themes. One is family law, family relationships. The other is war. The Yifat Toar story that we saw last week has both. It's the captive that you take in war. And the Ramban, on a different verse, when you have a war camp, be careful about doing bad things. The Ramban makes the comment that it's dafka war camp. In other words, the camp, when you go to war, you have to be more careful. Because the war, one is given license in war to do all kinds of things that normally you're not permitted to do, such as killing the other person. And because of that, the Ramban says, there's extra special attention to how we conduct ourselves in times of war. So the Ramban is also, the larger question over here, which I think is really an important question, is how one views the law in general. Judaism is a tradition in which law is pretty central, halacha. And the question is exactly what is the relationship between halacha on one hand and proper moral behavior on the other? That's a very interesting question, which the Ramban in one context, in several contexts, deals with. And Rashi, this famous Rashi in the beginning of what we looked at last week, Rashi's comment, Lo dibra Torah, ela keneged yetzer hara. Yes, and of course Rashi then interprets these sections as related to this concept. If you do something improper, it's legal, but improper, you end up with problems in the family, and you end up with this rebellious child. That's Rashi's interpretation. That's point number one I want to mention. And then before we get to the main topic of the day, and I'll stop and take questions, I want to point out something else about the laws over here, the law that I just mentioned. which is not our primary topic, but the man who has two wives. One wife, the Torah says, is beloved, ahuva, and one wife is not beloved, snua, literally hated, but let's say unloved. And there are children from each marriage. And he wants to favor the child of the beloved wife over the child of the unbeloved wife, to call that one the firstborn. Says the Torah, you are not permitted to do that. You can't pass over your firstborn and give the extra portion to the child of the beloved wife. That is forbidden. Lo yuchal levakir. It's forbidden. One of the 613 commandments. You can't do that. And when we read this portion, what strikes us, obviously, is, gee, we've come across this before, haven't we? Exactly this case. Because exactly this case is the story in the book of Breshit. It's exactly what Yaakov does to his children. He has two wives. One he loves, Rachel. The other is Snua, as Leah says about herself. Shema Hashem ki Snua Anochi. And therefore, and gave me this child. And the child she named Shimon. God has heard that I am Snua. And then Jacob, later in the book of Breshit, when he's blessing all the children, and he blesses Joseph, he gives Joseph two portions. The tribe of Joseph is not one tribe. The tribe of Joseph is two tribes, right? So Joseph has the extra portion of the firstborn, the extra portion. And Reuven, Pachas, the blessing of Reuven, if you want to call it a blessing, in chapter 49, Pachas kamayim al totar. You as quick as water, you act rashly, al totar, you get no extra portion because you ascended your father's bed, etc. So Jacob actually does exactly what the Torah says you shouldn't do. Exactly. Now, one can distinguish the two cases. One can say, well, in the case of Reuven, the reason given is not because his mother is unbeloved. The reason that the firstborn portion is taken away is because of his own misbehavior. That is certainly true. But it's hard to ignore the fact that what the Torah sets up over here is precisely what Yaakov does. Precisely. The two wives, the Ahuvah and the Snua, the two different firstborn, and Jacob takes away from Reuven and gives it to Joseph, which raises an interesting question in general about these laws and about the connection of the laws to the biblical narratives. What is their relationship? In this particular case, they seem to be in contradiction. In other cases, it would appear that it builds off some of the stories of Breshit, become encoded in some way later on with variations. So that's an interesting study. The relationship between biblical narrative on one hand and biblical law on the other is a fascinating study. Maybe some other time we'll delve into this more deeply, but I didn't want to follow up on what we talked about last week. Okay, let me stop here for a moment. If there are any comments or questions or whatever, please speak up.
I was just thinking that in the Korach portion, part of his community were from Reuven.
That is certainly the case. That's well said, yes. I would say that the rebellion of Korach, which is a very complicated story, I think that that is true. There are the Levim who want more. There's the tribe of Reuven, of the ringleaders from the tribe of Reuven. And I would say that what often happens in communities, in life, is that when the people are in crisis, when something happens to the community, and suddenly, out of the woodwork, all the people who have grievances come out of the woodwork. Now, remember, the story of Korach takes place right after, narratively, right after the people have been told they're not going to enter the land, and they're wandering 40 years in the desert, which is taken by Datan and Aviram, the Reubenites. It was taken by them to be. They say to Moshe, "You have failed in your mission. You took us out of Egypt, which wasn't so bad, they say. There was milk and honey or whatever. And you brought us to the desert to wander around for 40 years. You know, we reject your authority." And that's part of what's going on. All the aggrieved parties. The tribe of Reuven should have been the firstborn, should have been the leading tribe. And the leading tribes are Judah and Joseph. and Reuven is shunned to the side. In fact, Reuven later in the book of Bamidbar will not even dwell amongst the other tribes. They're going to want to go to their own little space. They'll be king. They'll be, a big fish in a very little pond on the other side of the Jordan. That's their idea. So the tribe of Reuven, maybe the firstborn who were passed over, maybe the Levium who felt they should be given more, maybe Korach, why is Aaron chosen in my family? What happens in general when you're in time, when bad things are happening, then suddenly the danger is that all the people with past grievances are going to jump out of the woodwork and to attack Moshe and Moshe's leadership, etc. And that's what you have in the story of Korach. The reality is, what's interesting about the Korach story, and I'm not going to spend any more time on Korach, but what is interesting is this, that throughout the Korach story, there's all kinds of complaints, which, by the way, when you read the parsha of Korach, you realize it's not just a few people that are dissatisfied with Moshe. It's most of the community. Most of the community actually have a lot of dissatisfaction because at the end of the day, he took them to Egypt and they're not going anyplace. And at each turn, God defends Moshe. God defends Moshe, God defends Aaron, etc. God defends them. The next narrative after Korach, the next narrative, because there's the rules of the Levium in chapter 18, there's the rule of the Parah Aduma in chapter 19. The next narrative is the story where Moshe hits the rock. And God says to Moshe, because you did not sanctify me, you had no faith in me, you're not going to lead the people. You read this, and everybody wonders, what was the grievous sin of Moshe? I'm not getting into that question now. But what struck me as that what's going on is, on one hand, the complainers against Moshe, God is Moshe's resolute defender, whether it's Miriam and Aaron who attacked Moses for marrying the Cushite, whether it's the Korach, whether it's the spies, whether it's Ruvain, I mean, whatever it is, God is defending Moshe every turn. And right after that, God says to Moshe, you're out. And for no good reason, it would appear. I mean, there are reasons, obviously. But it seems like for not a very great grievance, Moshe and Aaron, who seems to have done nothing at all, are told, in fact, that they will not lead the people. I think that's actually very interesting in terms of what we say to the outside world. That's one thing, you know. And there's also what we say to ourselves internally. What do we actually, you know, what is our own internal conversation about the situation, which doesn't have to be publicized, but it is an internal conversation. And we have in the case of the Korach, I found it always very striking that God is defending, at every turn, God defends Moshe. And the next narrative is God saying to Moshe, you're out. You can't lead them anymore. We need somebody else, which is exactly what they've been saying to Moshe. Now, they say about themselves, we need somebody else, namely ourselves. That's problematic. But I mean, but the fact of the matter is that Moshe, the situation is that we're in the desert and we're not going forward. We're going to wander around for 40 years in the desert. And when you have that kind of a situation, then suddenly all kinds of grievances, whether they are justified or not, there's a reason that Reuven is not chosen. There's a good reason for it. But from Reuven's perspective, I'm the firstborn. I'm the oldest. I try my best. He does try his best. He has no judgment. He tries his best. And therefore, that leads the tribe to, to try to assert their authority. And it leads them to taking, wanting not to cross over with the other tribes, et cetera, which is the book of Bamidbar. But your point is very well taken about the tribe of Reuven and the Korach rebellion in general. Anybody else, any comments or questions? We will continue. Otherwise, please speak up. All right, so we'll that was just from last week. I just wanted to complete the thought from last week. Okay, so now we're going to come to another issue of family. Again, what we're looking at are problems, obviously. And now we come to a text in chapter 22, which raised for our rabbinic tradition a host of problems. And I mean a host. Let me just make one comment before we read this, which is the following. We study together, and we look at what the Chumash seems to be saying. We call it Pshuto Shel Mikra. And there is, in addition to what the Chumash seems to be saying, there is an entire rabbinic tradition. There's a rabbinic tradition, there's a midrashic tradition, there's a halachic tradition, etc. And one of the interesting questions that most of the time we don't really have to deal with the halachic tradition because most of our studies over the years has been the narratives. But we are looking at the halachic sections. And one of the interesting questions when we study this is, what is the relationship between what the Torah seems to be saying and the various halachot that are derived from the Torah? And what we're going to be looking at now is one of the prime examples of something that when you read the Chumash, it says one thing, and the rabbinic tradition overall could not accept it, does not accept it, and reinterprets essentially what's going on in the parsha. This is one of the more glaring examples of this, but it's hardly the only example. I mean, we've never really addressed this as a major question, at least in my teaching. Others in Trisha have addressed it. But how does the halacha relate to what the Torah seems to be saying? Because this is one of the best examples. So we have it in chapter 22, beginning in verse number 13. It says the following: Ki yikach ish isha uba eleha usneya. A man marries a woman, literally takes a woman, cohabits with her, ba eleha, goes to her, usneya, and then he dislikes her, literally hates her. Usneya. V'sam la alilot dvarim, and he defames her. Alilot dvarim, he defames her. He says negative things about her. V'yotzi oleho shem ra, and he makes up charges against her. He defames her. Shem ra, gives her a bad name. He says, Et ha'isha hazot lakachti, I took this woman, I came to her, I found out she was not a virgin. I thought I married a virgin, but it turns out that she's not a virgin. He slept with her, and he could tell from when sleeping with her that that's what it sounds like, not a virgin. Fine. What happens next? It says, L'kach aviha na'ara v'ima, but her parents should take this girl, v'yotziu et betulei na'ara el zignei ir hashara, and they're going to prove that the girl was a virgin. They're going to take the proof of her virginity. They're going to bring it to who do they bring it to? Ziknei ha'ir, to the elders of the city. We have not discussed so far in our study of Dvarim the role of Ziknei ha'ir, the elders. What is their role? We talked about judges, we talked about prophets, we talked about kings, we talked about priests, but we have not as yet discussed the role of Ziknei ha'ir that appears several times in the book of Dvarim. Leave that for now. We'll get back to Ziknei ha'ir. They go to the Ziknei ha'ir, and they said, "V'yomar avi hanara." The father speaks up. The mother and the father both bring the evidence to the elders, but it's the father who speaks up. V'yomar avi hanara, and the father speaks to the elders. Et biti natati la'isha zeh. I gave my daughter to this man, la'isha, as a wife. Vayisna ela, and he hates her. V'hinehu sam alilot dvarim le'mar, and he has said negative things about her, defaming things about her, saying, Lo matzati livitcha betulim. Your daughter is not a virgin. She had sex already before I married her. But v'yela betulei biti, they're bringing this cloth with blood on it, presumably, right? And they bring this to the elders. Ufarsu hasimla lifnei ziknei ha'ir, and they spread the cloth open before the elders. So they see there's blood on the cloth. Obviously, she was a virgin. So what happens then? The elders take the husband, v'yisruoto. Here they translate, as the Gemara has it, v'yisru, to harm him. They give him malka, they flog him. So they beat up the husband. And on top of that, v'yanshuoto meya kesef, and they fine him 100 kesef, which he gives to the father. V'natnu lavi hanara. Ki hotzi shem ra al betulat Yisrael. He has defamed the virgins of Israel. V'lo tieh l'isha, and furthermore, she remains his wife. Lo yuchal v'shalcha kol yamav. He can never send her away. Can never divorce her. So he gets three punishments. One punishment is v'yisru oto. It's not clear what v'yisru oto means. Could mean to chastise him, but it's taken by the Gemara to mean they actually beat him. They hit him, they beat him, they flog him. On top of that, he has to pay a big fine of 100 kesef, 100. And on top of that, he remains married to her, and he can never divorce her. This is the parsha that is known in the tradition as Motzi Shemra, the defaming husband. The defaming husband. That's what it says. The problem is, obvious problem, the question that the Talmud raises, and it's a question we ourselves could raise, is that all of this seems in direct contradiction to everything else the Torah has said in this section of law. For example, I'll mention, well, there are two obvious questions over here, obvious questions. First of all, the Torah has said earlier in this section of law that testimony requires two witnesses. One witness is insufficient. Let's see if we can find that verse. It appears more than one time. Let's find that verse. Where would we find that verse? I think it's in chapter 19. Let me see. Chapter 19. It appears more than once. Chapter 19, verse number 15. Lo yokum eid echad beish, l'chol avon l'chol chatat, b'chol chet asher yechata. Al pi shnei edim, o shlosha edim yokum davar. Says the Torah in chapter 19 of this book, just shortly before these verses. One witness does not suffice for any sin. No guilt can be ascribed on the basis of one witness. So the husband, at best, is not more than one witness. Actually, he didn't really see anything. He's deriving from the fact that he feels she's not a virgin, that she must have done something, she slept with somebody before. It's not necessarily the case. That's what he's assuming. And what's even more striking is, so first of all, what kind of evidence is this? One could also ask the question, in addition, what kind of evidence is bringing this bed sheet with some blood on it? Is that really good evidence? That's one question. One is the question of evidence, an evidentiary question. That's one problem. But what is more surprising and more troubling are the next set of verses. What about if it's true? They don't have a bed sheet. They can't prove it. So they can't prove that she in fact was a betuah. Then they take her to her father's house, and the people of her city stone her to death. For she has committed a shameful thing. She has degraded her father's house. She has acted as a prostitute and degraded the father's house. You should sweep away evil from your midst.
Where are we?
Here's the double problem over here. What is the problem here? What's the main problem? The obvious problem is what? What's the obvious question here? The obvious question is, let's say it's true. Okay, she's not a virgin. So she slept around before she got married. So what? Okay, she's a zona. Okay. There's nowhere in the Torah that suggests that this is a capital crime. The opposite is true. Now, earlier, not here, but in Mishpatim, and one of the other codes, it says if a man, if a man is coaxing a woman to sleep with him, seducing her, then there's a fine. He has to marry her. If he refuses to marry her, he has to pay a fine. There's no suggestion that it's a capital crime. And let's say it's true, she's not a virgin. But in point of fact, we don't know when this other event took place. Did it take place when they were already married? Because presumably, first they get officially married. We have this in our tradition, this kedushin and there's nisuin. In the time of the Talmud, they were a year apart. Nowadays, we do the ceremonies together. Now the kedushin takes place, the chuppah is right away. So we have kedushin and nisuin together. That wasn't true in Talmudic times. In Talmudic times, they talk about giving the bride a year to prepare to live with the husband. So there's a time interval. But after there's kedushin, they're actually married. So she's an eshet ish. So if she's guilty of adultery, it's a capital crime. But who says this happened within the past year or whatever time the kedushin was? Maybe this happened 3 years ago. There's no evidence. We don't know when it took place. So why is she put to death? That's the second problem. How do we know when this happened? We have no idea. So these are the two major problems over here that the Talmud, anybody who reads this says, 1 second, there's no real evidence, just what this guy says. And on top of that, even if it's true, why should she be put to death? Okay, it's not a nice thing, but why is this a capital offense? Those are the two problems. When you read it, problems, I mean, it seems to contradict what the Torah says elsewhere. There's an internal contradiction over here between the parsha of Motzi Shemra and other legal sections of the Torah. That's the problem. Now the question is, how does the tradition deal with the problem? That's the which is not normally what we do in these sessions, but I think this is one of the classic examples of where the rabbinic interpretation feels that it's absolutely necessary to come up with some kind of alternative over here. What is the alternative? And the alternative raises a host of its own interesting problems. The alternative is based on something else, which is in turn problematic, which also appears in the law codes of Sefer Devarim. And it all begins with the question, actually, apart from the fact do we actually believe this guy? This guy has a vested interest in actually not telling the truth. Because if he's married to her, there is some kind of mohar, some kind of a bride price that was customary. The Talmud debates whether we call it nowadays, the term we use for bride price is a ketuvah. So we know the Torah speaks about mohar and matan, some kind of payment that the man who marries the woman is going to give to the woman's family, etc. We call it a ketuvah. So the guy he marries this woman. She was given this, probably pretty young person. The father gave my daughter to this man. And he realizes, after a short amount of time, he's not crazy about her. But he's married. If he divorces her or terminates the marriage, he's got to pay some money. So he may not want to continue to live with her in general. And he doesn't want to pay the money. So he has a reason. There's a reason to suspect that what he says is not actually necessarily true. Let's start with that. So he may be just defaming her. It's not true. And how are we going to prove that in fact he's lying? So we have this simla. We have this betting. The Talmud doesn't presume that this betting would be sufficient evidence in any event. What is that? And therefore, one understanding of simla is that it's not to be understood literally, but it's like to be understood as, they say, if it's as clear as a simla. I don't know where that expression comes from. Clear as a simla. In other words, it represents if in fact it's obviously not the case. Now, how do you know he's not telling the truth? So the Talmud is wrestling with two problems. How do you know he is telling the truth? And how do you know he's not telling the truth? So what does the Talmud read into this parsha? Which when we read it, it's obviously doesn't seem to be present. The Talmud assumes that when this guy is making a claim that this girl is not a betula, he has actual proof, not based on what he says. What kind of proof would he have? He has witnesses. And you need more than one witness. There are two witnesses that this girl had an affair after they were formally married. Is that in the parsha? Does it say it in the parsha? I don't see it here. But that's what the Talmud feels constrained to say. Otherwise, it's contradicting the other parts of the Torah, contradicts its own law codes. But then we have a different problem. The problem is, if he has witnesses that she had an affair, how is a court going to dispute that? The rule in the Talmud is 2 witnesses is the ultimate proof. 2 witnesses is the ultimate proof. Talmud has the expression trei kameya. If I bring 2 witnesses that you owe me $100, and you bring 2 witnesses you don't, that's 2 against 2. That's 2 against 2. Now, what happens when it's 2 against 2? What is the law when it's 2 against 2? Do you know? You have 2 witnesses, I have 2 witnesses. Reuben has 2 witnesses, Shimon has 2 witnesses. They say opposite things. Then the law is trei utrei. It's called hakchasha. Then we throw them all out. Then the status quo is what determines. You say I owe you money. You have 2 witnesses. My witnesses say I don't. Then what happens? Nothing. Then we keep the money where it is because there's no proof. It's 2 against 2. But you can never disprove the 2 witnesses. You can't disprove them based on 2 other witnesses. You have 2 and I have 2. But the Talmud says you can disprove witnesses. There is a way to disprove witnesses. And how can you disprove witnesses? This is a fascinating question. And it all revolves around verses that appeared earlier in these law codes. And that's found at the end of chapter 19. This is a text that I mentioned before. It talks about 1 witness not being sufficient. You need 2 witnesses. And then you get to chapter 19, verse number 16. Ki yakum eid chamas beish lanot bo sarah. If a witness rises up to testify falsely, maliciously, and give false testimony, then it says, V'yamdu shnei ha'anoshim asher lahem hariv l'fnei Hashem. I'm not going to get into all the details right now. Maybe we'll go back to this. This is fascinating. It says that, let's say the 2 litigants, let's call the 2 litigants, stand up before God, before the priests and the judges. And the judges study it diligently, drisha. They study very deeply. And they see the witness is lying. Then you do to the witness what the witness had intended to do to the person. Now, this is the parasha now called Edim Zomamim. Now, the Talmud makes all kinds of assumptions about this parasha. First of all, it assumes when it says witness, it means 2 witnesses. Witnesses come and say, Reuven killed Shimon. The judges have determined that they are lying. In that case, says the Torah, you do to them what they had intended to do to Reuven. They wanted to get Reuven killed. Then they are put to death. This is the parasha of Edim Zomin. I believe that in Hammurabi's code, one of the first, if not the first law in Hammurabi's code, it's right near the beginning, it might even be the first, is the parasha of exactly this parasha, what's called Edim Zomin. Witnesses will give false testimony to accuse somebody, and the punishment is you do to them what they intended to do. Now, the parasha of Edim Zomin raises a zillion questions, but here's the standard Talmudic understanding of Edim Zomin. I say standard. There's another interesting opinion about it. What bothers the Gemara is when 2 witnesses testify, how can you disprove them? How can you disprove them? If 2 witnesses say Reuven killed Shimon, 2 other witnesses say Reuven did not kill Shimon. Okay. Have you disproved the first witnesses? You haven't disproved them. It's a contradiction. It's 2 against 2. So you throw all the witnesses out. But you certainly shouldn't punish the first witnesses because who says they're lying? Maybe they're telling the truth. And the second set of witnesses they're the ones that are lying. So the Talmud says that's true. But there is one case, says the Talmud, where you believe the second witnesses as opposed to the first witnesses. And that is when the second set of witnesses do not contradict in fact what the witnesses said. The first witness said Reuven killed Shimon, and the court has a lot of questions. When did it happen? What day of the week was it? Where did it happen? Those kind of questions. Drisha v'chakira. And new witnesses come. Two witnesses come to court and say, Reuven, so listen, we don't know if Reuven killed Shimon or not. We have no idea. But here's what we do know. That on Wednesday at 2 o'clock, when you claim Reuven killed Shimon, you were not in New York City. You were in Philadelphia at a restaurant. In fact, we saw you there. So you can't possibly know whether Reuven killed Shimon because you weren't anywhere near. You in fact, you were with us. In that case, says the Gemara, we believe the second set of witnesses and not the first. Now, why we should do that is a good question. So there's all kinds of explanations because they're testifying about these people, and people can't testify about themselves, etc. That is the case of Eidim Zomin according to the Talmudic understanding of it. Now, when you read the Torah, you don't get that sense whatsoever. When you read the Chumash, what it sounds like is the judges have figured out through their own questioning, they come to the conclusion that the witnesses are false witnesses. Now, maybe I'll come back to that. But here's the point. The Talmudic understanding of Eidim Zomin becomes transposed to our text. The way the Talmud reads this is a man says about his wife, newly married wife, he comes to court with two witnesses. He says, this wife of mine had an affair. Here are my witnesses. Then the family says that's not true. We have evidence. We have strong evidence, clear evidence, right? We sometimes we say like clear as a bell. It clear as a simla. That it's not true. We have witnesses that those two witnesses were never there. They're Eidim Zomin. Under those circumstances, and only those circumstances, then the witnesses will be put to death, and the husband is fined. That's a Talmudic reading of this parasha. Again, when we read this parasha, we say to ourselves, how could you possibly understand it that way? But that's a very good question. And I think the answer to that question is the following, that there's no question that when you read the Pshuto Shel Mikra, there's no way it says this whatsoever. But I think that the Talmud sees itself as forced to interpret this way based on other pieces of the code. They have no choice. And therefore, they give this very forced interpretation in an effort to resolve contradictions. The bigger question for us is when we study the Torah, whether it's the legal sections, and even in some of the narratives, there are contradictions in the Torah. That is clear. The question is, how does one resolve the contradictions? The documentary hypothesis, whatever generates it, but what it intends to do, it's a hypothesis. It intends to resolve contradictions. Its method of resolving contradictions is by saying there is a contradiction. This is document E and this is document J. They're two different points of view. They're two different documents. They don't accord with each other. It's a real contradiction, can't be resolved, but they're two different people saying it, two different traditions. That's the hypothesis. We have no evidence that's the case. It's a hypothesis. The rabbinic tradition doesn't go for that path. The rabbinic tradition tries to resolve the contradictions. And generally speaking, in our studies, we try to resolve the contradictions. In the narratives, it's a lot easier to resolve them. There are, in fact, seeming contradictions in terms of the legal section, and that has to be dealt with. I'm not here to discuss, in general, resolving contradictions, but I did want to point out, it's very important because the parsha of Motzi Shemra is probably the classic parsha where the rabbinic tradition seems extremely forced, and I think what's generating this is the need to resolve this parsha, to make some sense of it in terms of what we read elsewhere in the Torah. Because there's no evidence that this girl had an affair before she was married, after marriage. Could have been before, in which case the Torah is clear. Now, if we take the parsha at face value, then what the parsha is saying over here is, if we take it at face value, then what it's saying is that the reason that this girl will be put to death is because she has somehow degraded the father's house. She's degraded the father's house, and it could be that the accusation, I would say, is not just she had a one-time affair with one person, but she is a promiscuous child. If that's the way one reads this over here, then it's parallel to what we see earlier in Parsha Kitetse about the Ben Sorer Umoreh, that they have this child. Let's say it's a boy. He's a glutton. He's a drunkard. He's disrespectful to his parents. He was warned about it. He pays no attention, etc., etc., etc. In that case, they can bring the child to the elders of the city, and the parents bring the child to the elders of the city, and the child is in fact hanged. The child is put to death publicly as a warning to the general community. So one way to read the parsha over here is seeing it's a parallel parsha to Ben Sorel Mora. That was a boy who does what boys do, drinking and whatever it is, and disrespectful, etc. The Talmud throws in stealing as well, etc. And now this parsha would be the parallel parsha. And it's interesting that certainly the question is, and the academics speak about this, was this ever actually carried out? When it comes to Ben Soreh Umoreh, the Gemara has one opinion that that actually never ever happens for any number of reasons. One is most parents don't want to do this. Second reason is that they put on so many constraints, and in reinterpreting the parsha, that it's virtually impossible to ever carry it out. So there are rules on the book. There's things on the book which are never actually implemented. In other words, I don't think we should necessarily assume, this is the bigger question as well, I'm putting it out there just for thought, we shouldn't necessarily assume that what's in the books is actually implemented. Many people assume what's ever in the Torah was actually the way people behaved and acted, and I say maybe not. Maybe that's what's on the books is one thing, and the way people actually behave is very, very different. I'm not talking only about the rules that are found in the Torah. I think many other rules that are not in the Torah, but traditions, maybe things found in the rabbinic tradition, etc. Were they actually carried out, or did people have a different way to behave? Not necessarily. It's what Chaim Soloveitchik wrote this article a few years ago about a kind of mimetic tradition as opposed to on the books. He claimed that after the Shoah, certainly, maybe even before that, there was a movement towards seeing all these pamphlets to tell us exactly what to do. And what was lost was that when people were behaving, people were doing things that they were told by their parents. The women in the kitchen, they were doing what their mother told them to do. They weren't looking up the Shulchan Aruch. There were traditions. That's one example. There were things that people did because that's what they were. That's what communities do. And it wasn't about consulting the Shulchan Aruch. It was about there was apart from that there are traditions. So I'm saying that in this parsha over here in Ben Sorer and Mora, certainly there the Gemara says straight up that according to one view it was never carried out. It's on the books to be studied, but never to be implemented. So there is a way to read the parsha. When we study the Torah together, we basically ask ourselves, what does it actually say? It seems to contradict other texts. Okay, contradicts. But you can't simply reinterpret in some way to remove the contradiction. But I just want to, I raise this here simply to point out that this is what is driving the rabbinic tradition. And let me make a couple of other points about this parsha, and then I'll stop and take any comments or questions. One point is that what's interesting about the parsha, the way it's set up, is that the Torah is clearly, as I see it, the Torah clearly is taking the girl's side. In other words, the presumption, the way it starts is, if a man marries a woman and he hates her, and he defames her, and he's motzi shem ra. Motzi shem ra is to defame someone, to degrade someone. Motzi shem ra in the Talmud is connected to not just the parsha over here, it's connected to lashon hara. Lashon hara is when I say bad things about somebody and they happen to be true. Then there's rechilut, where I tell someone what someone else is saying about them. And then there's motzi shem ra, where I say bad things about people that are not true. The Talmud takes a dim view of all three, but I'm saying the way the parsha is set up, it starts off by saying, this guy does this stuff, he gets a triple punishment. So the idea of the parsha, fundamentally, the parsha is set up. It takes the side of the wife, of this probably young girl. It takes her side. Yes, if it's actually true, okay, but the focus is actually on the punishment for the man. Just to make this clear, I would say there's another parsha in the Chumash which does the opposite, and that is the parsha that we read recently in the synagogue, Parshat Naso, the story of the sota. The sota is the woman accused of adultery by the jealous husband, and the Torah over there assumes guilt. Now, it doesn't assume she's necessarily guilty of sleeping with this other guy, but it assumes that she has done something wrong. She's hidden from the husband. She's warned her about it. There's an assumption of guilt in the story, to some degree guilt. Maybe not terrible things took place, but she's hanging out where she shouldn't hang out, etc. So that's a parsha which I think presumes guilt in some sense. We don't know how guilty. The parsha over here, Motzi Shemra, is the opposite. It presumes that he's a bad guy. He's defaming her to get out of his commitments. He doesn't want to pay he doesn't want to pay. And the Ramban says the normal mohar was 50 kesef, was 50. And the Ramban says this guy, if he's lying, he pays 100. He pays 100, and he pays double. So the Ramban says just like the thief. The thief in the Torah, the ganav, pays double, pays kefil. So this guy was a liar. He's not a thief, but he's trying to weasel out of his commitments, and therefore he has to pay double. The assumption over here is that he's the bad guy in the parsha. I think that is the assumption. There's a lot of focus on this parsha Motzi Shemra because of the contradictions, and because the parsha itself doesn't seem to make much sense. Actually, let me mention one other thing about this kind of interpretation. And again, when normally speaking, we would just look at what it says and be less bothered by the contradictions. That's generally the approach that we take in these sessions. But I'll mention one other case where it's understood by many to be a kind of metaphor. And this is a parsha that appears not in this code. It's something that we have come across in our, many of us have studied together and come across this parsha. And this is in the legal codes, not in Dvarim, but in the book, but in Shemot, in Mishpatim. And that is, I'm sure I'll just remind us everyone what it is. It's the following. In chapter 22 of Exodus, chapter 22, says the following. It talks about, the previous verses talk about a thief. If a thief steals and is caught, you pay double. That's called kefil. You pay double. But if you steal an ox or a sheep, you pay either 5 oxen and 4 for the sheep. It's called dalad v'hei. There's a punishment for stealing and slaughtering the animal, the ox or the sheep. Then you pay 4 or 5 times the amount if you sell it or you slaughter it. But the normal thief who's caught pays double. And then you have another parsha. What about if the thief is found tunneling into a house? So you have a house and you hear a noise and someone's digging a tunnel into your house. So you get up there with your shotgun or whatever and you shoot the thief and you kill the thief. Then the Torah says, Ein lo damim. You are not held responsible for killing the thief. The thief forfeited his life. There's no blood. You're not responsible. The Torah doesn't say why you're not responsible. But the Torah says you are not responsible.
Does he have to run to an ir miklat?
No, he sounds like he's completely innocent. It's justifiable homicide. No ir miklat. Ein lo damim. That's what it sounds like. Ein lo damim. It's as if he didn't commit murder. There's no blood. He didn't do anything wrong. That's what it sounds like. If he's tunneling into your house. The next verse is what interests us. Chapter 22, verse number 2. Im zarcha hashemesh alav damim lo. if the sun has risen and you killed him, the sun has risen, then there is blood, right? Then it says, Shalem Yishalem, if in fact the thief stole, right? If someone stole, he has to repay it. And if he doesn't have the money, he's sold as a slave in order to repay the debt. That's what the Torah has. Selling someone as a slave is the court forces you to be a slave only in situations where you're a thief and you can't pay. That's not our problem. Our problem is something else. What does it mean if the sun has risen, he has blood? Who cares if the sun has risen or not? What's the Why should that make a difference? That's what the Talmud discusses. What does it mean, im zarcha hashemesh? So it's interesting that one of the interpretations is zarcha hashemesh does not mean literally the sun has risen. Who cares if who cares if it's day or night? If someone's tunneling into my house, why would it matter if it's day or night? So one interpretation is metaphorical. It doesn't mean day or night. It means if it's clear as day. We have that expression. It's as clear as day. And what does it mean clear as day? It means, says the Talmud, it depends who the person is tunneling is. Can we assume that the one who's tunneling into the house, because the way the Talmud understands it, I'm not saying this is the pshat because we're not dealing with this, but the Talmudic understanding is that the reason you can shoot somebody, kill somebody who's tunneling into your house is there is the assumption that someone who tunnels into your house at night is going to be willing to actually kill you if you resist. You are permitted to resist. And the reason is when someone tunnels into your house at night, says the Talmud, they know that people are home at night. They're not working. They're inside the house. So they're tunneling into a place where they know there are people, and they're assuming they may try to stop me. In which case, if they try to stop me, I have to be ready to stop them. So because of that, the assumption is when they come at night, they are prepared to kill. So my killing is a kind of act of self-defense. The one who's tunneling into my house can be seen as a rodef, a pursuer, and permitted to kill him. But if it happens in the daytime, they're assuming nobody's home. There's people who are not home in the daytime. So since they assume no one's home, we can't assume they come to kill. They come to steal. They assume no one's going to be there. Therefore, we can't just kill them because there's no reason to assume they're going to kill us. They may rob us, but robbing is not justification for killing somebody. That's a simple reading of the text. But the Talmud has a different reading of the text, and a different reading, in addition to what I mentioned. And that is that day and night means similarly, but it means it depends upon the person. And they give the example of it of a father and son. If the father is tunneling into the house to rob his son, the son is not allowed to kill his father because the son has to assume that a father would not kill his child. But if it's the reverse, says the Talmud, it's very interesting. If it's the reverse, that the son is tunneling into the father's house, then we can't assume the son wouldn't kill his father. Can't assume that. He might kill his father. And that's the example. In other words, they give the example of father and son, but it means if you know the person, this is not a killer. The guy's up hard for money. I know the guy who's coming in. We can assume it's obvious this is not a violent person. He needs the money. On the other hand, if we can't assume that, then you are permitted to kill him. The question would be, what is the default? Is the default that you can assume the worst? Or is the default you assume the best? Okay, that's the question. But if I cite this for the simple reason that one view in the Talmud is im zarcha hashemesh alav means if it's clear, which is exactly parallel to what they're assuming about this about the sheet, about the simla. When they bring the bedding to the court, bedding means they're bringing something which is obvious. It doesn't mean actual bedding. It means they can prove obviously that this never happened, or they can prove perhaps it happened at some other time. But the point is that you have in these two situations, because they're bothered by the text, they can't assume it matters whether the sun is risen or not. If it's 9 in the morning or 5 in the morning, what's the difference? So they interpret, because they can't see a different way, Some interpret the son to be parallel to the simla, and that is, it just means if it's obvious. So they're taking the text in a kind of metaphorical way. In general, when we study together, we never do that. I mean, on the rarest of occasions. But I simply want to point out that because of difficulties with these texts, which they think are not just stories, but these are practical legal matters, and because they're practical legal matters, it has to make more sense for them. And we're trying to create a system of law. So in each of these two cases, they're interpreting the, in our case, the bedding, the simla, the sheet, actually, literally, and the son in the Machteret episode as if it's clear as day, if it's obvious, etc. These are very important parsha to be familiar with, by the way, because they're emblematic of and it's very relevant to the entire enterprise of the rabbinic tradition, was to try to create out of basically not that many verses. The Bible has about three main codes, 3 or 4 main codes. There's no complete code in the Bible. They're all very partial. And the rabbinic project, which is quite amazing, is to try to create from a book, which is basically about stories, to try to create some kind of legal code. And to try to reconcile, as they typically do, one text with the other. And that's what they're pushing for. Whether they really believe that this is what the Torah is saying, or whether they are justifying a tradition in light of the Torah, that's my own personal view. They have traditions, but it has to be justified. And they have to find a way to justify it in terms of what the Torah says and also in terms of what makes sense. You know, they're trying to create a code which is a sensible code, etc. So what we looked at is 2 things today. One is a good example of how the rabbinic tradition is forced, from their perspective, to reinterpret the text. And then we also went back to what we saw last week, which is about the nature of law in general. That law is responding to kind of reality. In the case of our parsha, to war, what things that happen during war, etc., and understanding that under certain conditions of great stress and great danger, people will act in a certain way, and we have to accept that to some extent, and we try to deal with it. We try to clean it up as best we can. That's the parsha of the Yafat Torah. So we have just a couple of minutes left. I wanted just to, before I get to the, yes.
Yocheved?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the question of witnesses, because you have an interesting parallel here where the husband is a single witness against his wife.
Yes.
And in response to that, you have the parents where there is a single male witness in response. And that's an unusual situation there, where also you could say you have a male and a female on each side too, but they're not on the same side, right? You got 2 women and 1 man on one side.
Right. I think that the determining factor, as far as the Chumash seems to be concerned, is the sheet, is the sheet, which is evidence that, you know, in fact she was a betula. The sheet is how do you understand the sheet? Does it mean literally a sheet? It could be literally a sheet, by the way. The Talmud speaks of exactly that. This is completely not our own sensibilities, but that the Talmud speaks. The Ramban mentions this, that there were cases that would get married, go into rooms, sleep together, and then they what's called the shushbinim would be waiting outside. They'd come in and take the bedding, and they would have the bedding, and there would be a big celebration. So I know this is not this runs counter to many of our sensibilities, but the fact is, it's not something which is unheard of in ancient cultures. There's no question about it. I don't know about nowadays in certain parts of the world, but
there are probably still cultures that do that.
There probably still are. I mean, there's a whole other interesting discussion about this. Not for now. There's all kinds of interesting stuff about this topic, but not our province right now. But the fact is, but the determining factor seems to be the simla in the story. That seems to be the. I want to make one other comment here, just about this general topic of marriage over here, and maybe this will lead us to the next to the next, either next week or the week after, we'll deal with this. And that is, last week we talked about this Yafat Torah, the captive consort. And the Torah said, if after she goes through all of these procedures, and then he decides that he doesn't want her anymore, it was during the war, it was combat, he sees this beautiful woman, and she's going through this 30-day process, and he says to himself, what do I need this for? I need this foreign woman. Then the Torah says he has to send her away. He can't sell her. He has to send her away. He can't. He's not allowed to mistreat her. He's put us through a difficult ordeal. One of the questions that is raised by the commentaries, which I think is a fascinating question, he sends her away. What it sounds like is he says after a certain amount of time, listen, dear, I thought it would work out. It's not working out. You're free to go. You're free to go. Now, the question is, when does he say that? Does he say that on day 31? Does he say that on day, maybe they're living together for a year and he says it's not working? How much time? The Torah doesn't say. And one possibility is that it's not day 31, it's a bit later. If that be the case, what's very interesting is the Torah makes no mention whatsoever of giving her any kind of formal bill of divorce. We are all familiar with, obviously, that to terminate a marriage, that the man gives the woman a bill of divorce. That's a given. There's gittin, tractate gittin, and all of that. And one question is that necessarily the case? Now, first of all, in the case of the Yafat Torah, the commentaries already raise this question, because it seems to say, listen, it's not going to work. They have perhaps a quasi-marriage of sorts. There's some kind of marriage here. Is it a full marriage? Is it more like a concubine or something like that? It sounds like there's some kind of relationship over here, which is not necessarily seen as full marriage, which doesn't require any kind of formal separation. He says to her, it's not working, and goodbye. But I raise that because of a different question, which is more serious, which is, what about get in general? Where does the Torah speak that if a man wants to terminate the marriage, he must give his wife a bill of divorce? Does the Torah say that? Now, the answer is the Torah does say it, but it says it in the strangest way. So maybe next week we will, it's right here in this code. The whole get business is found in a few words in the book of Devarim. And actually, it could have been interpreted very differently. One could have interpreted the Chumash to obviate all the get problems. One could easily have read it differently. So I did want to start next week with the question of get, just to point out where the context in which it comes, because it's fascinating. The context of get is not about get. It comes up as a kind of aside. It doesn't come up as the primary issue in the Chumash whatsoever. It comes up in very tangentially in terms of something else that we'll look at next week, which is relevant to marriage. And then I did want to spend some time on two other topics. Hope we have time. One is Yibum, levirate marriage, and the other is the Ben Soreh Umoreh episode, the wayward child, etc. That's the plan. So we'll continue next week with it. I did want to mention once again that my book on kingship, which was sponsored by our own Tova Bulow, is out now. It's not out formally till the end of July, but Drisha has copies. So anybody interested in the book, I think it's a very interesting book. And it's written focusing on the book of Shmuel, which is a very great book. It has all kinds of interesting things. It's actually revised from the Hebrew. It's not identical to the Hebrew. It's revised. I think it's improved to some extent. I did write it, so I obviously I'm say possibly edus. I'm not I'm invalid witness, but I think it's a very interesting book. And thank you, Tova, again. Okay, so we'll continue
Rabbi
next week.
Silber, Rabbi,
Yes.
Could you tell us when you'll be introducing it at HIR?
July 12th, there's we're trying to set up a whole bunch of book talks. July 12th at 7 o'clock at HIR. I'm going to talk about the book. I'll give a shiur, and the book will be available then, July 12th. So there are going to be other events as well. I want to get to Manhattan too, but we'll see. Anyway, thank you all very much, and we will hopefully continue next week with these unhappy topics, but important to study them. Thank you.